Welcome to episode 163, A Wounded Healer Heals, Dr. Yalom on Life, Loss, and Therapy, featuring Dr. Irv Yalom, MD. For information about the free CE credit associated with this podcast episode, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and my goodness, today is an unbelievable honor for me. I am joined by none other than Dr. Irv Yalom. He barely needs any introduction at all, but you may know Dr. Yalom. I know I do. My initial introduction was through the infamous group psychotherapy book, and then a lot of other books that he's written over the years, including Love Executioners, When Nietzsche Wept, Lying on the Couch, just to name a few. And Dr. Yalom, thank you for joining us. Why don't you take a minute to further introduce yourself, and then we will jump into today's topic.
Well, I'm Irv Yalom. I'm a psychiatrist. My career has primarily been spent at Stanford University, where I've been in the Department of Psychiatry forever. I'm emeritus right now. Live in Palo Alto. Have 4 children. My wife died, and I've recently written a book. My wife and I wrote a book together. Half of the book we wrote together, and then I wrote the second half after she died. So that's what's been in my mind mostly.
Yeah. So for our listeners who are not yet familiar with the book, let me tell you about it. It's called A Matter of Death and Life. And in it, Dr. Yalom and his wife, Marilyn, talk about her experience and also his experience of her approaching death and how they manage that both as individuals, as family members, as both passionate in their careers and as a married couple. Dr. Yalom, where should we start in talking about this book? I mean, it is so beautiful, so profound.
Well, let me tell you about the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book was my wife had a cancer of the blood called multiple myeloma, which is sometimes treatable, and sometimes people live for 15 years with treatment. My wife got that disease about 8 or 9 months before she died. She had many different treatments. None of them were successful. One day when we were taking a walk, there's a park right about a block from our home, and we were taking a walk down the path, and my wife says, I have decided that I think that we should write a book together about what's happening to me. And she went on to tell me what thoughts she had about it. And I said, well, that's all very interesting, and I do think you really should write that book. And because I'm writing another book myself, a book of stories about psychotherapy. She says, oh, no, you're not going to write that book. You're going to write this book with me. She was all of about 98 pounds and about 5 foot tall, but she was very strong, and she had a way of being quite pushy about that. So I started to write that book with her, and that's how we wrote this book. She and I wrote alternating chapters for the first half of the book until she died of her illness. And the second half of the book is my life without her in the first several months. It's called A Matter of Death and Life. What we mean by that, it's her death and my life afterwards. One thing that I might mention is that our life ended with this book together. Our life together also began with the book. Let me just tell you a story about that. I believe it's somewhere. Maybe it's in this book. I'm not sure where. I've written a lot of books, but when we were, I was about 14. I met her. I was in the 9th grade of junior high. I had moved from another part of Washington, a not so nice part of town, to a much nicer part of town where I'm. I started junior high in my 9th grade, and I went out bowling with somebody in my classroom. We used to bowl at a nearby bowling alley, and Always used to like to gamble on the bowling, and that was always fun for me. Afterwards, he said, there's a party at Marilyn Koenig's house. Why don't we drop in there? I didn't know who she was. Of course, I didn't know anyone in this part of town, nor had I ever been to a party before. So we went over there, and we got to her house, and we could just see a big mob of kids all trying to get in the front door. The front steps were all blocked and everything, with just a large mass there. So my friend said, "Listen, why don't we go in through the window?" So we went over to the side of the house. He opened the window and we crawled in, and I saw her there at the other side of the room, greeting people at the door, people all around her, and I didn't know what to do. So I wound my way over to her, and I said, "Hi, I'm Irv Yalom. I just climbed in through your window." That was my introduction to her. And as you said, I didn't have a lot of grace about personal grace. But I did get her phone number, and I called her a day later, and we agreed to meet in Washington, D.C. There was a place called the Hot Shop, which had nice ice cream sundaes, and we had an ice cream hot fudge cake. And during the course of eating that, she told me that she had skipped school that day. I said, "You what? You skipped school that day?" And she said, "Well, she had started to read Gone with the Wind, and it was so long. It's a long book. She had stayed up all night reading it, and she was too tired to go to school. She had to sleep during the day." I was blown away, first of all, by her skipping school, but secondly, by her doing this through reading a book, because I had spent my first 14 years of my life mostly reading books, always. I went to the library every day. I lived in a very bad neighborhood. It was pretty dangerous outside, so I just read continuously. And she was the first person I ever met who seemed to care as much about books as I do. So that's what I mean. Our marriage, our relationship started with books and it ended with books.
And for our listeners who can't see Dr. Yalom right now, he basically has a background of books, of his beautiful bookcases. And I know in the book, Marilyn talks quite intimately about her own affection for books. And that sounds like one of the things that always connected you two.
I'm in my office right here. My office is about 150 feet from my home. I can just see it out the window. So this is where I see patients, and this is where I spend most of my time writing.
This book is something that has never been done before. And granted, you were really the first one to write a book on group psychotherapy, but that's a separate conversation. A book like this that's so intimate, that talks not only about your love and your grief, but also that experience for you as a clinician, having worked with so many people who are also grieving. You acquiesced when Marilyn put a little bit of pressure on you about writing this book. For you, did you find the process of writing to be therapeutic?
Yes, especially the second half of the book. When I was writing, I was in deep grief, and writing it helped me a great deal. And the first few chapters were fine. Marilyn and I were writers together. I had written some books, and at one point she's a scholar. She got a PhD in French and German literature and comparative literature at Johns Hopkins, and was always first in her class. She was first in her high school and junior high school class. I went to her valedictorian comments. She was a very bright lady. Anyways, that's really how that book started. One time I got an award from the Rockefeller Foundation, and they invited me to spend 2 months at Bellagio, which is a writer's studio in Italy, in southern Italy. So we went there, and they give you a family apartment, but then for the person who wins the award, they get a special office where they can write during the day. So that's what I had. I was writing during the day. But Marilyn was telling me about who had not written before, But she was telling me that she was thinking about a project she was doing where she was reading about women's firsthand observations of the French Revolution. And as she talked about it more and more, I said, I think there's really a book in there. Well, why don't you think about that? And so he went to the head of the Bellagio and see if we could get an office from there, and said, no, we don't give spouses offices. But just then the head of the organization came by. He said, wait a minute, there is an open office for you. It's in the woods. There's the big forest around Bellagio. So we walked in the woods about 10 minutes, and there was an oak tree, or a huge tree. I'm not sure if it was oak, but with a ladder. And you climbed up on the ladder, and there's a big tree house there. And she loved that tree house, and she started to write that book, and that was her first book. And after that, I would say she matched me book for book. We were always together. She wrote a large number of books as I did.
For you to write together the way that you did, for many therapists, I think especially for newer therapists, there can be this internal and sometimes external pressure to really remove ourselves from the room, to show up, to be the notorious blank slate. And this book is essentially the antithesis of that. This is you saying, here is really the most painful experience of my life, and being very open and public about that. How did that affect your grieving process? Does it feel violating for somebody like me to know these things about you, even though you don't know me?
No, it doesn't. I tend to be very open, and I find that's very helpful in therapy with patients. After Marilyn died, and I was in grief and just lying in bed, and my eye fell upon my bookcase, and there were copies of each of the books I had written. So I started looking through those books, and there was one book that I picked up first, and it was called, had a funny name, Mama and the Meaning of Life. That's because one of the stories had to do with a dream I had about my mother. But as I looked through the table of contents of that, there were about, I think, 8 or 9 stories in there. One of them was one that shocked me. I'd forgotten all about that. I'd written this. It was called, I think, 8 Advanced Lessons in the Therapy of Grief. And so I started to read that story. It was a great interest. I'd forgotten that I'd even written that. But I did work for quite some time with people who are in grief. And for years, I led a group of people whose spouses had died. Both men and women were in the group. So I'd sort of forgotten about that. That was a long time ago, 25 years ago, perhaps. And I started reading that story, and it was a story of me treating a professor at Stanford who had lost her husband. And before that, a couple of years before that, she'd lost her brother. And she was a very angry lady, angry at the universe, angry at the hand that life had dealt her. And she would say to me, you don't know how I feel. You can't help me. You sit there in that nice pink striped shirt. Nothing bad ever happens to you. And so I started thinking about that as I read that story. I began thinking as I'm going through my own grief, I understood her much better now. And I began to think that maybe she was right. Maybe I could do a much better job on her than I did then. I did treat her for about a year and a half or so, and eventually she got better, but it was very, very hard work. And I began to think of all these patients who had lost a spouse, and I had treated in a therapy group for a great many years. I also ran a therapy group of women who had metastatic cancer. And a very extraordinary woman came to me, and she had that disease. She had metastatic breast cancer, and she asked whether or not I would lead a therapy group of other women. She would be able to organize women, and I thought about it for a while, and I agreed to do that. So I led that group for many years, 8, 9, 10 years, perhaps, because as the women all every single one of the women died of that disease, and then new members of the group came in. And when I was in that group, I began to develop a lot of anxiety about death as I saw so many people die. It was really hard. I was leading the group alone, and it's hard work. And I began thinking about, I think it's time for me to get back into therapy. I was so anxious then. And I saw that Rollo May, a well-known psychologist who I had much admired, and I'd read almost all of his books, but he had just moved to my area, so I started seeing him in therapy. But we worked together for about a year, and then I felt better, and we stopped. Much later, though, I became very close friends with him. I was with him when he died. But he told me that although he had helped my death anxiety a good bit, his had gotten a lot worse. And because he was 22 years older than I did. So that was a little interesting experience for me. I'm rambling here a bit.
No, I think you brought up a lot of really valuable points in that. And goodness knows. So as we record this, here we are in a pandemic, and this concept of parallel process that I think for therapists can be really uncomfortable to access that pain, that grief, that anxiety, that hopelessness, whatever it is. And you're really open in the book about that. You talk about, these explicit moments leading up to Marilyn's death and afterwards about these experiences and going, oh my gosh, I'm now on the other side and can feel this really deeply. If you had to go back with that one patient who made the comment about the pink striped shirt, what would be different in your work? Do you feel like you would say something different? Would you self-disclose if you had the opportunity to treat her now?
I would certainly self-disclose. I would tell her what I had gone through and how long it took me to get over that. And although my personal situation with grief is a little different from most patients because, I had known this woman all my life since I was 14 years old. And I knew that when she died, my prognosis was not going to be good. I just had never met or treated anyone who had been in this kind of intense relationship from the ninth grade on, and we were inseparable. After we graduated high school, she went away to college, and that was the first separation we had had. She went to Wellesley, and I started medical school. And after the first year of medical school, I transferred. It's very unusual to transfer from medical school. But I found there was Boston University Medical School had an open place there. So I applied to get to Boston, which is quite near Wellesley. And so I had the separation of a couple of years when I was in undergraduate school while she was at Wellesley, but then I moved up there, and then we were never apart after that.
In your book, you talk about the phenomenon of death anxiety and your own realization and reflection over the years of your experience as a clinician, that essentially the more of a sense of an unlived life you have, the higher your experience of death anxiety. And I have more questions about this and also Marilyn's chapters as she's thinking about these concepts herself. Can you talk for our listeners about death anxiety, about how it showed up in your research, and really what we clinicians need to keep in mind about this phenomenon and this consistent existential threat?
Well, I've been thinking about that a whole lot. I'm not doing therapy anymore. I'm too old. My memory is slipping away, and I don't think I feel comfortable doing ongoing long-term therapy with people. But I've decided that I do have a lot to offer still, so I decided to offer single-session consultations. And so for the past, ever since Marilyn died, I've been seeing one person a day, and that's ended up being a lot of people. I mean, we're talking about hundreds at this time. So I'm doing these single consultations. I'm seeing a lot of people who are coming with death anxiety. And so I've gotten to do a lot of thinking about it. What the formula that I've felt before, but I feel so much more strongly now, is that the greater the death anxiety, the more regrets one has about the way one has lived one's life. And if you live a life more or less free of regrets, I do. As I think about my own life, I think about my relationship with my wife, and I think about what I've done in the field. It's incredibly more than I could ever expected myself. One of the things I did when I was in the worst time of grief was I started rereading for the first time. I started rereading my own books, and that was quite a wonderful therapeutic experience for me. I felt pleased with what I had done. I felt I'd written honestly and well. And I right now I have almost zero anxiety about death. I feel I've lived my life fully and well, and was lucky enough to spend my life with this wonderful woman. I've been in a great profession, so I have no regrets. I have very little death anxiety now. Um, Sometimes when I think about death, I think about this thought comes to my mind that when I die, I'll be joining Marilyn, and that somehow gives me a lot of comfort and relief, even though with my operating mind and my brain, I know that that's absurd. That Marilyn isn't alive. She doesn't exist any longer. She's dead. But still, this irrational part of my mind gets comfort from thinking I'll be joining her. It tells me something about the importance and the power that religion offers to so many people. The idea that there'd be some kind of continuity after death, although to my scientific mind, it doesn't seem possible.
Now, sitting with people who are coping with death anxiety, now at a time probably higher than many generations and in a very different way. We've had so many losses, just the United States alone, so many people that are going to be approaching Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, anything else, all of these important days in their lives, birthdays. You talk in your book, and you've talked a lot over the years and in other books and in research about that anniversary phenomenon. When you're working with clients now, do you provide psychoeducation for them about that? For someone who has lost somebody recently, do you say to them, this is what you can expect, and this is what it was like for me?
Sure, I've worked with seen a lot of people in consultation who are in grief, and I will talk to them about my grief. I'll talk to them about getting some help with it. I've been seeing a therapist after Marilyn died for the last few months now. It's been very helpful, and I think it's good to have a therapist. It's good to be in therapist and talk about this and have someone that you can share everything with. So yes, I will advise people to get some help with this, and I think. Experienced therapists need to learn how to work with grief. I hope my book might be helpful to many of them.
Mm-hmm. I think the transparency is refreshing, and the vulnerability that both of you bring to it. Marilyn herself talks about feeling at peace as she was reflecting back on her life, looking at her children, at her grandchildren, her contributions to the field, to society, that she felt okay with that. And you talk on your end about struggling with her okayness, if you will. For both you and for Marilyn, you've had the opportunity to have these long lives, and that was something Marilyn talked about quite a bit. I'm curious for you, conceptualizing working with somebody who's either facing the mortality of someone around them who's much younger, or they are facing their own mortality and are younger. How does that change it? Because both of you reflect on that phenomenon of like, I've had a good run, basically. How do you think it shifts that for people that have not had as good of a run?
I get them into therapy. I have them talk about what happened between them and the person they lost. I look at that very, very deeply. Sometimes they forget all the good parts of what their relationship was like. I will go over their lives. I'll wonder about what they can do in the remaining life if they have that will not cause them to have regrets later on. So I will do all these things, or at least now that I'm just doing one sessions with people, I'll get them into therapy with some good person around the world. A little easier now with online with Zoom therapy. See someone who's not necessarily right next door to them.
You've been through that first year now, and here we are talking sometimes almost academically about this book that is not the practice of group psychotherapy. What is that like for you to talk about Marilyn constantly, as now that it's out in the world and your experience and the depth of what you felt, and to share it so openly? What's it like for you even now to talk about it with me?
It's not as painful as it once was. I've as I say, I don't think I'm ever going to be over this entirely. Um, I've, I get hurt when I look at a picture of Marilyn. I don't have pictures of her. I have to admit this. I'm a little embarrassed, but I don't have pictures of her in my office or many in the house, because every time I look at the picture, I feel a stab wound. So that's hard for me, and I have to admit with some embarrassment that I have not visited her grave for the same reason. I'm slowly doing this work. I'm fortunate enough to have 4 children, and so in some ways there's pieces of Marilyn in all of the children, and we talk about that a good bit. 3 of the children live within an hour drive of my house, so every week 1 or 2 will come over for 1 or 2 days. So I'm getting good care for my children. The other one's is a several-hour drive. He'll be up here for a week for my birthday coming up next week. I'll, I'll be 90 in another week or so, which is really old. In fact, I don't know anyone older than I am right now, except for my Nietzsche and Kierkegaard teacher at Stanford, who's 93, and we still meet and take walks very often together.
When you meet with clients now in this very short-term work, I imagine that's shifted your approach significantly.
Well, it's somewhat different, but not entirely different, though. I try to give everything I can in this single session, and do as much as I can for that person. And often it means getting them persuaded to get some help if they need it. I'm in an unusual position with seeing clients for a single session, because almost anyone who comes to see me has read things that I've written. That's why they contacted me. So I am imbued with a great deal of power. And so I've tried to use that power by helping them look at themselves, look at what they accomplished in life, look at the good parts of themselves, talk about areas that need to be worked on. So I always spend some time in the here and now in the session. Without fail, I do that. That's always a good part of the session. Sometimes as much as a third or half of the session. Whereas I will say, let's take a look at how you and I are doing in this session today. What's that been like for you? What are the questions you've been thinking about asking? What's it like? Are you upset? How did you feel when I talked about my childhood? When I talked about losing my wife, what did you feel then? So I spend a lot of time looking at the here and now, and some people absolutely can't do that. And I know for a fact already these people have a great deal of difficulty with intimacy, and I want to focus and try to help them work on that and talk to them about what they need to work on in therapy. It's different for everyone, but the sessions usually always contain my looking at the here and now, looking at the interpersonal work going on between the two of us.
Back in 2016, when I went to the Evolutions Psychotherapy conference, one of my takeaways that really struck me, a message I consistently heard, was the importance of authenticity, the importance of showing up, discussion about self disclosure. And that's a big change from where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago, in this idea that therapy was this very transactional thing that used to happen, and it's still transactional in a different way. But the intimacy, you talk in the most recent book and in other books about the importance of the therapist to show up as a real person in the room. That idea, can you talk more about that? Because I think that's so powerful. And to hear from someone like you who's had so much influence in the field, like, hey, this is how I show up, and this is what it means to show up in the room and to really nurture intimacy with somebody. What does that look like for you?
Well, this has been gradual for me. It's not natural for me. I don't have, growing up, I certainly didn't have much social skills, nor did I have a lot of friends in those first 14 years of life. But when I started the field to get into psychiatry, um, I did have a background that many people entering the field didn't, which is I was a voracious reader, which means that I have virtually, there's hardly any times in my life at all, except when I'm studying for a final exam or something, that I haven't ended the day with reading a novel. So I'm deeply versed in literature in that way. And when I started my training in psychiatry, there was a great deal of interest in psychoanalysis, of course, but there's also a great deal of interest in interpersonal work. In my day, one of the best known therapists was a man named Harry Stack Sullivan, whose probably name is not very well known to many of you, but because he's a terrible writer and his books are almost illegible, but he introduced the whole importance of looking at relationships that people have had throughout their life, not just early memories of their parents, looking at fantasy life, but who are their chums? Who are their friends? What's going on in their life? And when I started my training, I was very interested in reading Sullivan and also another therapist named Karen Horney, who was a German therapist, who was talking about the same thing, but in more uh, more easily apprehended kind of words and methods. I started, one of the first things I did when I started my residency was spend some time watching a therapy group with one of my really important mentors named Jerome Frank, who had very interested in group therapy. And the residents were asked to watch this group probably for, I don't know, maybe 6, 8 weeks, watch it meet once a week through this two-way mirror. But I continued watching it the whole year. I was just fascinated with it because the way that group was led and the way group therapy, effective group therapy is led, is that we begin to look at how people relate to one another in the group. There's not an interest in past history and older history. How do you relate to the people in the group? And how do you relate to the therapist? How does the therapist relate to you? So I became fascinated with this idea of interpersonal work, which is best seen and known in therapy groups. So I began doing group therapy then. After a few months, Jerry Frank invited me to come in and do the group with him. He was a real mentor of mine in group therapy, and I've been interested in group therapy as well as individual therapy ever since.
This interpersonal relational work between client and therapist, I mean, you're doing it even now when you're seeing somebody for one session. What do you feel like is foundational? What have you learned over the years and how to really nurture connection?
Well, I think one thing that's always important for me, say in these single sessions, is personal self-disclosure. I have, I will talk about, people will know that I've lost my wife, and they'll talk about that. I'll talk about my grief and what's going on there. So I'm very open about myself. I know that makes some therapists feel very uncomfortable, but I find invariably it helps therapy. It helps me really proceed much more effectively with this client that I'm seeing, even for a single session. And then what's more, I'll follow it up. I'll say, how did you feel about what I just said about my childhood?
When you're considering self-disclosure, I've thought myself about I pull from the movie kind of hovering above oneself and observing the interaction and asking yourself, what's the value in what I'm about to self-disclose? For you, what do you see as the primary value in self-disclosure and how it nurtures connection and intimacy with a client?
Invariably, it helps people disclose themselves. I always move my self-disclosure into interpersonal work about, how did you feel about my telling you there about my childhood? What was that like for you? And I always get an answer. I mean, like 100% that the people appreciate my sharing that with them, makes them feel closer to me, makes them trust me more. It always has that effect. And that's almost without exception.
In your line of work, over the years, you've worked with so many different clinicians, with so many different clients. I'm curious, through your eyes, what are some of the potential cons of self-disclosure?
I haven't encountered any of these. I mean, I'm using my common sense. I'll talk about my disclosure. I'll talk about the fact that I've been in therapy several times. I've said that to many clients, especially clients who need therapy, especially clients, for example, who've had a very difficult first 3 or 4 years of life, where there was a lot of early trauma in their life, and tell them about how important a role that will play in your later life. Tell them a little bit about Bowlby and Harlow's work with primates, and how people growing up with a lot of trauma in their first few years of life that are going to need therapy. And I do this to persuade people, don't stint yourselves. Get some help when you need it. I've been in therapy about 5 different times, and I'm very open about saying that.
I think just that for some clinicians is kind of revolutionary, just that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody is curious, like, oh my goodness, who does Yalom go see for a therapist? Who does one of the grandfathers of psychotherapy see for therapy? But this idea of doing our own work as well is pretty fundamental. But because there's such a stigma in our field about mental health, I think even therapists find ourselves affected by that stigma and trying to act, maybe feeling this pressure to not be part of that, to not have our own struggles. And what I've heard so much in the field in the last 10 or 15 years is the importance of showing up with authenticity and being real people.
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of that. It's the way I work. It's what I teach my students. And it's what I write about.
You mentioned a little bit ago this idea of, and I'm loosely quoting, but being over Marilyn's death, that you're not quite over it. What does over mean to you through your work, having done so much in the field, in grief, in your own reflection and experience of grief, what does over it look like for you?
Well, let's see. That's a difficult question. Um, I'm not sure I'll ever be over her. I think of her a good bit. And of course, it doesn't help that I'm living in the same house in the same rooms that she was, and things that reminders of her all around. And I have 4 children and lots of grandchildren who all knew her. So I doubt if I'll ever be over her life. Maybe if I were a good bit younger. I'm very old, but if I were a good deal younger, I might perhaps want to find another partner, and maybe that would help me re-enter life in another way. At my age, though, that certainly is not anything that's going to happen or I'm going to want to happen. Um, so the grief, my grief just persists. But I'm functioning quite well. Have a lot of friends, go out, do things. So I'm functioning well. But in my mind, I ache when I think of.
For those of us who have had an intimate relationship with grief, I think everybody has their own definition of what it means to be over it. And I think, and I preface this by saying, of course, this couldn't apply to everybody, but that over it means carrying it with you, and to pull from what you just said, to still be functional, but be able to carry and know that it hurts and that it's probably always going to hurt.
Well, I think I'm functional in that, I'm have a lot of friends. I see people. I do various things. So I'm certainly functional. I think I'm doing these constantly. I'm also writing. The writing is terribly important for me. In fact, I always think of it as a lifesaver. To write that book with Marilyn and another book I'm working on right now. And I spend a good bit of time of my day writing. I've always done that. So that's a special little lifesaver that I have for me. And if I were to finish this book, in fact, I'm not going to finish this book because I don't want it to end. I don't know, well, what will I do if I'm not writing? That would be hard. So everyone has their own kind of issues about that, but for me, writing is a tremendous help. I love to spend. I'll come to my desk to write, and I'll wake up 4 hours later having gotten out of my chair.
For you, writing helps give you identity and passion and meaning. Do you see that as pivotal to grief recovery for the folks that you've worked with?
Oh no! It's. I've spent my life as a writer. People have spent their lives in other ways, perhaps in more social ways too.
But that, not necessarily of writing, but that idea of connecting to one's hobbies and passions, and that kind of redirection to rediscover who somebody is in the midst of grief.
Yeah, well, it depends on how you get your meaning in life, and for me, it's always been through writing and through my friends. I have a large group of friends who come over and visit me, and my children. So I don't like to spend too many days alone without anyone here. So I always take walks almost every day with one friend or another. That's very helpful for me.
In your work, what have been the most impactful tools, coping strategies? Like, what are the things that clinicians need to keep in mind in supporting somebody who's grieving? You talked about hobbies, you just talked about social connection.
Well, one thing that's important is, of course, to have had some experience with it yourself. And always I link to that. What are you going to feel about your own life if it were to come to an end soon? Would you feel that you've really lived and done what you wanted to do in life? And what are the regrets you have? And can we take a look at those regrets? And is there some way you can operate or live with fewer regrets. What would you like to do? As I mentioned earlier, I just don't have many regrets about the way I've lived. It's hard for me to think of any. That gives me a lot of comfort.
Why do you think that is? I'm curious, like, in your values, what do you think permitted you to have fewer regrets retrospectively? Like, what is it about personality, about opportunity, about risk tolerance? How do you see that? Like, what's a formula? I guess, what's a formula to not having regrets?
Well, it's not difficult. If I were to start to ask you about your life and about what regrets do you have and what were your hopes for your life and what are the things about yourself that you've never fully lived or fully expressed in your life, I'm perfectly willing to kind of get into that kind of conversation with people. What sort of dreams did you have about your life? Are there ways in which you've disappointed yourself? That's generally the tact I would take.
In this idea of being in the here and now and being present for the space between therapist and client, you've seen the field over many iterations and the heavy focus that has happened, especially in the last 15 years, on evidence-based practices, that we need to be doing some acronym in order to be therapeutic. I'm curious, how do you feel about the pressure, I think, particularly for people who work with insurance companies or in agency-based environments, that we have to have a certain acronym that we're using in order to be of benefit? How do you feel about that?
I try to form a close relationship with that person. I am self-revelatory. I'll keep getting feedback. How are we doing in this session today? When were we closest? When were we furthest apart? What's going on between us today? I'll look at that very thoroughly. So I spend a lot of time looking at the here and now. In my practice and also in my writing and certainly in the consultations. I don't do cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm very different from that. I'm really trying to use myself and look at how people relate and how they relate to me. So I'm taking a very interpersonal stance towards working with the clients.
In prior episodes, I've had the honor and opportunity to interview Dr. Scott Miller and Dr. Daryl Chow, and I'm myself a trainer in feedback informed treatment. And everything you're saying is along the same lines of that concept of the space between therapist and client, that consistent check-in.
Mm-hmm.
Do you So when we look at the work of Barry Duncan and Scott Miller, they've pretty well manualized that concept. But for you, it's just an integrated part of the work. Is that one of the things that you would really like to see in the field, to have more focus on what's happening between us in the here and now, instead of do XYZ and it's going to improve your insomnia, or do XYZ and let's do some thought stopping or whatever it is, but to reshift and focus on that space between?
Well, maybe there's a place in certain clients for that kind of work, but for all the clients I see, I'm using the first one that you mentioned, where I really demonstrate how one can look at oneself and how one can relate to one another. So maybe that's in part a function of I've spent so much of my career in group therapy, where I teach people how to relate to others and how they begin to explore their relationships with other members of the group. So that group therapy textbook's a very long textbook. I think it's its sixth edition now, and it's about the last edition is about 800 pages long. So I spent a lot of my life writing that and checking all the group therapy literature about that. I have the last two editions. I've had a colleague named Olin Lesh. He's the president of the Group Therapy Association here. So I've had him as a helper in that book. But I've enjoyed my group therapy work very much, and and there's a lot of therapists that I see. In fact, of these consultations that I'm doing, I'd say over half, maybe 60, maybe 70% are therapists who I talk with from all around the world. And many of them, as I listen to them and see their awkwardness with other people and see how difficult it is for them to relate, I will urge them to get into a therapy group, because there are more therapy groups now for therapists that are forming, especially in the United States. And I give them a couple of names of people who can refer them to a good therapy group for therapists. I've been in a therapy group for therapists for some 35 years. A couple of my colleagues and I started a group. I'm not the leader. I'm just one of the members. It's a leaderless group. Everybody is in there is a therapist, and it's been going on at Stanford for all these decades, and I've found it extremely useful and helpful to people. So, if it's possible in your community to form a group of therapists, I'd recommend you doing that. I think it's going to be helpful to every therapist.
I think there's a lot of value in what you just said, because when you're talking about checking in with a client and saying, what was that like for you? Where were we further apart? Where were we closer? That requires a lot of awareness and a lot of ego strength. And I can hear the value of sitting in a room with other therapists and having the time and space to observe self as other, if you will, to work within that space. How did you nurture that? You talk about how when you look at your earlier years, feeling like you were socially awkward and then working through that. How did you do that to become that self-reflective and aware of yourself in the room?
Well, I've been in that therapy group for so long. That's been quite helpful. And I've had a lot of therapy through my training, and there was a group of our residents where we did this. So I think right at the beginning of the field that if one gets the right therapy and one gets the right teachers, as I had with Jerry Frank, I think it's a good part of one's training. So I'd urge you students to be in a group.
With the time that we have left today, I'm curious, what are the general gems of wisdom that you have for not only new therapists, but for therapists in general? What's your advice for therapists as they exist in the world at a time like this?
Join a group. Be open with people. Get yourself into therapy yourself as a therapist. Get into therapy maybe more than once in your lifetime. As I say, I've been in many different types of therapy. My first therapy was when I started my residency, and I was in traditional psychoanalytic therapy 4 times a week for 3 years. That was my initial treatment, and it's the kind of approach to therapy I don't care for. I didn't feel it was helpful and worth all that time that I spent, because the therapist was unavailable. In fact, she was even out of sight. I couldn't see her because she was at the edge of the couch. I bent my head back to see her and never spoke to herself. And for me, that was a good lesson in how not to do therapy. So I operate very differently from that.
I think there's a lot of value in what you just shared, and thank you for that disclosure about your own therapy. My last question for you today, if it's all right, what do you look for in a therapist?
Oh dear, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer that with anything new. I think a therapist has got to be.
So interpersonal connection, intimacy, vulnerability.
been in therapy several times during his lifetime, is willing to be open in his conversations with you. So those are the things that I look for.
Dr. Yalom, to have spent this time with you, for me, has been an extraordinary honor, and I'm sure for our listeners as well. Tell us again a little bit more about not only your most recent book, but some of your other books, your websites, how people can learn more about you and your work. And I can't really believe that anybody's listening to this and doesn't know who you are, but still, how can they find you online?
Well, I've written a lot of books. I've written, I think, 4 novels and several books of stories, all of them about psychotherapy. I've not wandered too far away from that. And I wrote a book about Schopenhauer, but it was really a book about how to do group therapy using Schopenhauer, who was the most unlikely person in all of history to have been in a therapy group. So that was a way I had of teaching something about group therapy. So I've got books of stories, I've got novels, and I've got some more textbooky kinds of things that students can read.
You know, as we talk about this, we've talked about connection and interpersonal relationship. One of the other things that I've always read and seen in your books, and I see it now, is your use of humor. And that's fundamental to being who you are and how you've impacted the field. And I think why your voice is so effective in the work that you do. Dr. Yalom, thank you deeply for your time today. I sincerely appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me to be on your program.
In order for us to be able to provide this continuing education learning opportunity with Dr. Yalom, we want to further discuss some of the themes Dr. Yalom mentions during this discussion. In the episode, Dr. Yalom talks about the idea of autoethnography, which focuses on the intersections of personal experiences and the culture in which those experiences take place. This harkens back to a study in 2012 by Ulrich and Luttengorf about the impact of journaling about stressful emotional life events. They found that writers focusing on the conditions and emotions developed greater awareness of the positive benefits of the stressful event than the other two groups, and this effect was apparently mediated by greater cognitive processing during the actual process of writing. In the interview, Dr. Yalom discusses his own self-disclosure and therapy session and his reflections about self-disclosure over the course of his entire career. According to Edwards and Murdoch in 1994, a study of 184 psychologists revealed that 94% use therapist self-disclosure as a therapeutic technique and to model behavior. In Staring at the Sun, Dr. Yalom shares, "I share the fear of death with every human being. It is our dark shadow from which we are never severed." In 2001, Barrett and Berman found that therapist self-disclosures resulted in greater reduction in client symptom distress, as reported by clients themselves. This idea of therapists being authentic about their grief can be clinically impactful. For individuals interested in learning more on this topic, there's an article called "To Share or Not to Share: Current Research and Thoughts About Therapist Self-Disclosure" on the Society for Advancement in Psychotherapy's website, authored by Kristen Pinto Coelho, PhD. In Dr. Yalom's recent book called A Matter of Death and Life, he notes, "These are human being to human being, not so much therapist-client moments, and these moments have made a huge difference to me and to my clients. It is very heartening to know that even when we get it wrong, i.e., being human, we can make it right with authenticity and kindness. This idea is an extension of the research by Dr. Barry Duncan and Dr. Scott Miller about the clinical value not only of therapeutic authenticity, but also of the importance of therapeutic repair when there have been moments of misattunement. How we clinicians lean in to the conversation with the client and take a more person-centered stance instead of ignoring or glossing over our uncomfortable experiences in therapy." In the interview, Dr. Yalom discusses the impact of death anxiety on how one processes their own mortality. A study called Death Anxiety, Depression, and Coping in Family Caregivers at Walden University in 2016 found significant relationships between death anxiety, depression, coping, and duration of caregiver experience of grief. For clinicians who are interested in further learning on this topic, we recommend the book called Death Attitudes and the Older Adult: Theories, Concepts, and Applications, published in the year 2000, particularly Chapter 9 by Timur and Eliasson, titled Beliefs About Self, Life, and Death, Testing Aspects of Death Anxiety and Death Attitudes. In the interview, Dr. Yalom also discusses the anniversary phenomenon, an effect that can cause an increase in grief symptoms at annual markers of the loss. For listeners interested in learning more about this anniversary effect, we recommend the study Anticipatory Anniversary Effect in Bereavement, Development of an Integrated Explanatory Model from 2010 from the University of Hong Kong. As we wrap up this interview, I want to leave you with this, a quote from Dr. Yalom's lying on the couch. Only the wounded healer can truly heal. Thank you for listening in. You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.